Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 8 of the World's 2023 Swiss stage, and it's our final day, I guess you could say, of round number 4 before we get to the do or die round number 5, the 2-2 matchups. Very excited to cover them here today. We are going to know 2 more teams that are going to qualify for the quarterfinals in today's video, and we will also know our final 2 teams to be moving to that 2-2 section of Worlds. Very exciting stuff, some very interesting series with a lot on the line, but I'd love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on these series down in the comment section below. Did they go how you expected them to? Did you maybe get a little bit surprised by some of the outcomes? I know I'm certainly excited to talk about some of these games, but would love to know your thoughts on everything down below as per usual. Of course, quick plug, if you are enjoying the video at any point throughout your time watching this, whether it's now or in 40 or 50 minutes, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot. It really helps, this video and the algorithm, and hit subscribe so you can be there for the rest of the content here at Worlds. But again, don't want to pander to you too much. We've got a lot to cover in today's video, and so let's just jump right into it. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual performance, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything up. At the end of the video, we are quickly going to preview what you can expect from day number 9. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm very excited to cover it and go over it, potentially talk about the teams that I expect to see in the quarterfinal stage, because it's going to be interesting nonetheless. The draws have a lot of potential outcomes for the matchups we could potentially see, so definitely excited to go over it. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first series of day number 8 here, and it's the matchup I think a lot of Western fans were more excited about. We always love our NA versus EU matchups, and especially when it's our number 1 seeds going head-to-head, when it's the last hope from North America, it's definitely a lot on the line. We have a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCS in NRG and the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports. On paper, this is a pretty unbalanced matchup. G2 has kind of just been better over the course of this year. I think a lot of people, me included, saw G2 as just like the best version of a Western team in the current landscape. Neither the LEC or the LCS, in my opinion, was particularly strong this year. I think we've seen that from a lot of the teams throughout the tournament so far. Is just that, while they can hold their own against some major teams, they're just really not going to be able to keep up fully with them. We've seen that from basically every single LCS and LEC team up until this point, with the exception of G2, who really has been able to hold their own, taking down teams like DK and Weibo Gaming, looking good in those matchups. Obviously losing to Gen.G in that best of 3 a couple of days ago, but Gen.G certainly not a bad team, in my opinion, one of the top 2 teams in the world at the current moment, and so you do need to value G2 a lot, and they've clearly proven that they are not just a good team, they are a really good team, and they are officially 1 series away from making it to the main stage of, Worlds, the quarterfinals, the bracket stage, where they want to be, the minimum of where they want to be, but NRG is standing in their way. NRG kind of being the last bastion of hope for North America here, with both Cloud9 and Team Liquid eliminated here in the main stage. NA has not performed particularly well at this tournament up until this point. C9 got the job done against MAD, but TL really didn't do anything. They looked interesting against T1, but they weren't able to win even a single series here at Worlds, and Cloud9 obviously just flamed out earlier on against T1, that's who it was, and they didn't look particularly good in that series either, and so NRG kind of being the last hope for NA is pretty apropos, considering they're kind of the NA team at the current moment, the developing North American talent. You've got the core of Dokla, Contracts, and Palafox that have all gone through the academy system. They've all gone through tier 2, been up and back, and not really been given the same kind of chances that maybe some other top prospects or top players or big imports have been given in the North American system. Adding on to that, a new bot lane of FBI and Ignar that a lot of people didn't really have high hopes for going into the split. NRG has constantly outperformed expectations. They were the surprise LCS champions. They are now the surprise last hope for North America here at Worlds. They're definitely going to be underdogs going into this, but some really fun matchups to watch out for. Palafox has been pretty good at this tournament, and him versus Caps is certainly something that I think you definitely have to watch for. Palafox can beat anybody, especially from the West, on any given day, and Caps has certainly not been the most consistent of mid laners, and I think another really interesting matchup for me is a pair of former I guess, pseudo teammates in the top lane. I think a lot of people forget when Broken Blade was on TSM, Dokla was on TSM Academy, and so these two have probably scrimmed each other quite a bit. They're probably pretty familiar with each other's games. Now they're playing each other on the world stage. That's certainly an interesting storyline to end up having, and one that I'm really interested to see how it ends up coming to fruition, if you will, but a lot of fun matchups here. FBI Hans-sama, which was very FBI favored when Hans was in LCS last year. Just a lot of really interesting things. Contracts versus Yike. It's a really fun kind of dynamic, and it's always fun to see these two regions' #1 seeds go head-to-head. But who's going to be able to take the series? Who's going to be moving on to the quarterfinals? Well, we got to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was NRG. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this is how you kick it off for NA. You kick it off with a nice win. Basically, everybody on NRG looking really good in this game, but you're going to shout out a couple of players in particular. I really like the draft strategy from them. I think G2 has a ton of options in this game as well. I certainly don't think that NRG just straight up out-drafted G2, but they do give themselves more options specifically in the mid-game, which I think is the strongest part of the game at the current moment, as we've seen throughout this tournament. And that's generally going to be a positive, but really, at the end of the day, NRG just kind of outplayed G2 in this one. We can talk about draft diff, and, we'll kind of go into potentially some of the ideas that both of these teams went for. It's definitely more of a proactive approach for NRG and a more scaling approach for G2, but if you don't outplay your opponent, it is kind of doomed in this one, and I think G2's draft has a lot more merit than people are giving it credit for. There just are a few flaws that I want to point out as well. So, let's start with draft, as we do on this channel. We kick it off with that. I think it's an interesting draft strategy for both. Like I said before, it's definitely a difference in ideology. NRG wanting to go for more of this mid-game power spike approach with the Vi plus Nico mid-jungle duo. You have a lot of playmaking tools for that in the mid-game if you want to go for these 3v3 skirmishes, or more importantly, if you want to go for these Rift Herald fights at 10 minutes, or if you want to go for second dragon, want to try to take these big fights early on in the game to try to get, try to get the snowball rolling out of control. You have a lot of tools to actually be able to win that, specifically because you don't really need a lot of pressure in any of these lanes for them to be strong. Dokla in general is going to be able to win really efficiently on the top side here on K'Sante, because that's just where K'Sante is at the moment. As much as I like Jax, he's not particularly strong early into K'Sante, and you're really hoping that you scale up and you can outperform him in team fights. That's why you take that champion. I still don't think it's a particularly good pick into K'Sante, but nonetheless, K'Sante should have a lot of pressure by himself early, and Senna and Tom really aren't going to need a lot of that pressure early, even if you can talk about the Kai'Sa potentially getting online in this game from a draft perspective. You've got more agency in your middle part of the map, if you will, on your top side of the map. Not only will K'Sante be able to move, but Nico's a really good early game champion. Syndra, good in lane and certainly good into the Nico matchup. I don't think it's a big problem for Caps to be able to play that out, but Nico's much better at moving around the map and trying to create these more advantageous plays, especially alongside someone like Vi, who can be pretty proactive. Now, if you follow the channel, you know I'm pretty against the Vi pick in the current moment because it is very feast or famine. You do need to get those plays off, and you need to get the ball rolling, or else you're just not really going to be all that useful by the time you hit the late game. But if you do get the ball rolling, she still can be a relatively good champion. I see her as a slightly worse version of what Jarvan offers at the current moment, and so it's kind of interesting to see them prioritize that. But either way, we can talk about how G2 went for scaling as well with the Kai'Sa, plus the Syndra, plus the Jax. A lot of these teamfight-oriented threats that aren't really going to be all that useful as early on in the game as maybe NRG would be, and then going for something like the Bel'Veth, which of course is kind of the EU, the LEC special over the course of this year. So many junglers kind of prioritizing her over other regions. It's very interesting to watch, but I don't hate G2's draft. I think they have options here, specifically if they are the better team. I think this is the better draft. You're kind of relying on your players to be able to outplay and outperform their opponents, and in this game, they just weren't able to do that, which is okay, but maybe a little bit surprising if we're being honest. Player of the game, though, for NRG was kind of a toss-up. There are two obviously phenomenal performances in this game coming in from NRG. Whether you want to give it to Contracts or whether you want to give it to Palafox, I think it really is up to you, but mid-jungle definitely deserves it in this game. Player of the game for me is going to go to Palafox. I think some of those Nico engages were just spectacular. They were just phenomenal. When you see really great performances on this champion, it really does remind you kind of the difference between a really great mid laner and just kind of an okay mid laner, because we've seen so many just average Nico performances, but then you put Nico on someone that is proactive and does want to go out and make plays and has good synergy with their jungler, and all of a sudden that champion just gets completely unlocked. It's super fun to watch. she can be an absolute blast. I know she's a terror to play against in solo queue, but she's really fun at the pro level, and Palafox definitely showed that off. He's sneakily been very good at this tournament. He's had a couple of up and down moments. I would say that game against Weibo was just not very good, but ever since then, ever since he started playing mid laners that, you know, quite frankly are closer to his skill level, he's kind of shown that, no, actually, he's really, really good. Like, he's going up against Caps in this game. It's not some pushover mid, and he looked phenomenal in lane and specifically, you know, out of lane, pairing up with the rest of his team, but Contracts also deserves this player of the game just as much as Palafox does. It really is kind of a toss-up who you want to give this to. I gave it to Palafox for a lot of the flashy engages, but Contracts was doing a fantastic job of being able to create opportunities for Palafox to be able to make a lot of those flashy plays. Contracts has been spectacular for this team. His re-emergence and his confidence building over the course of this last year has been essential towards what this team wants to do. Obviously, being given another shot here in the LCS last year on CLG, carrying that over into NRG, there have been moments where it hasn't looked as good on this team, but they've stuck with him, they've trusted the process, and they know that he can perform at a very high level when he's playing well. He can be feast or famine, but it's very much been feast over the course of 2023, and this is just another example of that. He made Yike look pretty silly in this game in terms of pathing. He was everywhere on the map. Yike was not making a difference in the game, and you just have to give him credit for that. Contracts and Palafox were genuinely elite in this game. Fasting Senna looked really good. I've been, kind of asking teams to pick up this champion for quite a while. FBI is a big fan of Fasting Senna. He's played it a lot over the course of his LCS career, whether it's on Evil Geniuses, whether it's on 100 Thieves. Back in the day on Golden Guardians, I'm sure he played it. I don't really remember it, but specifically the 100 Thieves days, we know he played a lot of Fasting Senna, and he's really good at it. This champion can be really proactive and can actually do quite a bit in the mid game, which you're maybe not expecting from her, but it gives Tom an opportunity to be really effective if you want to play, her with Tom in the bot lane, or it does give you more options to maybe play other bruisers. We've seen things like Wukong in recent months as well, and so I like this idea of potentially going towards that, specifically if things like Xayah and Kalista are still going to be highly prioritized in the meta, and then obviously Kasante's awesome. So everybody on NRG performing well, but G2 honestly not playing particularly well in this game. You can talk about, draft being a problem for them not having a ton of tools in the early game to create pressure, but I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think Caps on the Syndra has potential to be able to fight, especially in the 3v3s. I think Kai'Sa and Rel have potential to be very active in this bot side, especially if Yike wants to play for them early on. It's really just Broken Blade who's not going to have any sort of prio at all in this game, and I don't think they did anything with it. I think they honestly just got outplayed. There really is no other way to say it. They were not as good as NRG in this game. There's not really a lot of other factors that you can blame it on, in my opinion. Dud of the game is going to go to Mickey X, but I think you could realistically give this to Hansama as well. The bot lane in general looks not as good. I'm going to be honest. I'm a bit concerned about Hansama. It's something that is certainly lingering in my mind. We talked about it before the tournament. We've talked about it at the tournament, but Hansama definitely prefers these more lane-dominant AD carries, things like the Xayah, things like the Kalista, things like the Caitlyn, that he has been able to play over the course of his entire career. Draven, obviously, in that same vein, but even when you think back to Rogue last year, or 2 years ago now, or even Misfits, back when they were making, crazy runs, Hans was always this guy that wanted to play these more aggressive bot lanes, who wanted to try and trade 2v2 in the early game, and teams are just taking that away from him. They're taking away the Draven, they're taking away the Kalista, they're even taking away the Tristana, which I think is for Hansama, could be for Caps as well, but these more proactive, these more aggressive-oriented AD carries, bot laners that, can play a little bit farther forward. You're forcing Hans onto something that has to be a little bit more scaling-oriented, and he's just not as comfortable on that style. We've seen that. The Kai'Sa's not looked good from G2, and Mickey looked really lost this game, having to play a little bit slower in the bot lane. He's going to get done of the game, like I said, on the Rel. It just wasn't a very good game. When you're consistently going in on Rel without really a lot of follow-up, it's not particularly good synergy. We know Mickey plays off of his team really well, but they're usually not in these positions where they can't make aggressive plays. I'm a little bit worried about G2 if they're going to be put in this position again. Perhaps not drafting scaling is going to be a little bit better, but NRG is really kind of forcing their hand, taking away a lot of the big AD carry picks out of that bot lane. Outside of that, Broken Blade kind of got smashed on the top side of this map. That's kind of to be expected in this matchup. I do not like Jackson to Kasante, and he really wasn't given a ton of help. Yike got jungled circles around by Contracts, who was just better than him this game. And Cab certainly did try. There were moments where he was dealing damage in this game, and he wasn't giving over a ton of pressure for free. He definitely was the best performing member of G2 in this game, but it's not like he particularly played great. Palafox outplayed him in that matchup on the other side of the map. And so for G2, you do have to be a little bit concerned because, quite frankly, you were the worst team, not just because of draft, but in terms of performance in game number 1. Now, that's not to say they can't bounce back and win game number 2. That certainly is a possibility. And it's hard to say that they're not still favorites because it's still a best of 3, but you have to win the final 2 games of the series now. You gave NRG a pretty big advantage in this game number 1. Are you going to be able to keep the series alive, or is NRG going to be able to close it out and upset them in a clean 2-0 sweep? Well, the winner of game number 2 was NRG. They are going to take game number 2, and they are going to clean sweep G2 Esports, and you hear it right. LCS is going to the quarterfinals. NRG has officially made their way into the top 8 here at Worlds, and I couldn't be happier. I mean, not because I'm an NA-based person or an NA fan or anything like that, but because these players deserve it. Like, there is just not a lot of circumstances where I can sit back and say that a group of players that have been overlooked and undervalued as much as these guys are going to be making the quarterfinals at Worlds. It is such a fantastic statement to make, even if you're not an NA fan, that I think you have to be excited about this win. You have to be excited about what this means for this group of talent and potentially for, you know, the landscape as a whole. We'll kind of talk about that as we get into it, but just in general, the unlikeliness of this win, the lack of probability that they were able to not only beat G2, but especially beat them 2-0 and kind of dominate them in both games, like make neither game particularly close. G2 just got outplayed in every single role in both games, which is crazy to say. It's really impressive from NRG for a team that, by all accounts, should not be in that position. This is a team that, according to rumors, has a 10% scrim rate win. Like, that is awful. According to rumors, didn't win a single scrim against G2, their opponent in this series. It's crazy how much they've outperformed some of their expectations, but this is what a good mentality and faith and trust in your players can do. You can put yourself in a position to really succeed, and I'm really proud of what NRG was able to do. G2 obviously losing this is disappointing for them, and I'm sure European fans aren't exactly happy about this outcome when it comes to G2, but cut them some slack. They're going to be just fine. They're moving to 2-2. They still have another chance to be able to qualify for the quarterfinals. They're not done just yet. Their road does get harder. This is always going to be their easiest series to qualify for the quarterfinals, but it's not like it's done and dusted. It's not like it's over. They still have the opportunity to potentially draw an easy team going into that 2-2 section, but let's talk about this game number 2 before we get into, I guess, too big of, like, tournament implications or anything like that. NRG's just awesome, man. Like, their jungle mid just played out of their minds in this series. This is the best that these two have played all year. I think this is the single best series that I've seen these two play, and that's impressive to say the least because they were awesome in finals as well. But player of the game and player of the series for me in game number 2 here is going to go to Contracts. And what a turnaround from Contracts, not because he was ever, like, awful, but just because he was kind of looked at as a known quantity for, like, a super long time in the LCS. He was somebody who on Golden Guardians back in the day was always the death leader in the league, would consistently make these super aggressive plays, these super aggressive invades, and sometimes they'd work, and a lot of times they wouldn't, especially because he was surrounded by less than stellar talent to be able to follow him up on that. So he gets sent back down to Academy. He gets some time in Tier 2. He does really well in Tier 2. He gets some sporadic appearances back in the LCS for 100 Thieves, for Evil Geniuses, for a couple of different teams, but he finally finds a home on CLG back in the LCS where he's given an opportunity to grow around this young core, and he's made the most of it. He has been awesome in the LCS. In my opinion, summer of 2023 was his best split back on, a major team here, and I think it really goes to show that you can't really count a player out. It doesn't really matter what they've shown on tape. They're always capable of improving and cleaning up a lot of their weaknesses if they're willing to get into the practice stage and grind it out and get back to their roots and really figure out the root of the problem. And the Contracts did that. He's become a super consistently positive threat for this team, mostly on engagers, on facilitators, which is crazy, considering what he was mostly known for at the beginning of his career on Cloud9. So you just have to be super excited for him and for this team as a whole for taking a chance on him and having it work out as well as it has. He gapped G2 in this series. Like, he gapped Broken Blade, he gapped Caps for sure. And he certainly gapped Yike. I talked about that in game 1. Yike has a really good champion matchup in this one, playing the Poppy into the Jarvan. Poppy in general is just so strong in the current meta. Not only did they get Poppy on B2, but they got the Xayah on B1, who's very good, in my opinion, easily the best champion in the game on this patch that we have at Worlds in the meta that we've currently developed. And Contracts made everybody on that team look absolutely silly. He gapped everyone, and that's crazy impressive on Jarvan. He's just been phenomenal for this team. And then you have Palafox, who obviously was awesome. He could very well be player of the series in the same vein. He was just as good as Contracts was. I mean, it really is flip a coin to determine who you want to give that award to. This is, no bias. This is the single best game of Taliyah that anybody has played at Worlds in 2023. I mean, he utterly dominated. This was masterful coming in from him. And this is a champion that really has not worked all that well at this tournament. It's not had the same kind of success that maybe you would expect from a shove and roamer that wants to play the super macro and skirmish-oriented style, that mid-game power spike style. It's just not worked, even though it's particularly meta right now, but Palafox made it look completely broken, pairing it up with the Jarvan, moving around the map, constantly holding pressure, and just outplaying Caps, basically at every single opportunity. Palafaker and Contracts were ridiculous. El Contracto and Palafaker is probably how I should address them here, were just phenomenal. And it's not like they were the only ones. Dokla was by far the better top laner across this series. FBI and Ignar were definitely the better bot lane in this series. NRG just gapped them. There really is nothing else to say. The mentality that NRG had going into this tournament, I know a lot of people didn't end up seeing that Travis Gafford interview with Demonte and FBI, but where they end up talking about how they studied G2 and they listened to some Caps interviews, and they talked about how one thing that really changed their perspective was his view on the game and how he takes every single solo queue game, every single scrim, entirely seriously down to the last moment, where it's not just like we're winning at 15, let's remake, or it's a solo queue game, I'm just gonna kind of lax and not really care, or it's a spring match, it's not something that I can learn from. They made every game a priority for themselves over the course of this year, and they've gotten better and better and better. That mentality shift is the reason that they're in the quarterfinals now, and you have to be excited for potentially the future of NA League of Legends because of that outcome. You never want to be too, over dramatic about that kind of stuff, because NA teams are so stubborn and they'll do anything to not invest into talent like this, but here's the results of it right in front of your eyes, the quarterfinals. And then for G2, obviously, it sucks. Like, you don't want to go down in the series. You definitely don't want to go down 0-2 to a team like NRG that was by far going to be your easiest challenge to get into the quarterfinals with, but it's not like your tournament's over. You definitely played bad today. I'm not going to try and pretend like they played well in any stretch of the imagination. Like I said earlier, basically everyone got gapped, whether it was top, whether it was mid, whether it was bot, whether it was jungle. Everybody got gapped in this series. Dead of the game in game 2 is going to go to Caps on the Azir. He was kind of the lone member that was performing okay in game number 1 on the Syndra, was trying to move around, was doing at least decent in some of the skirmishes and some of the fights that were generated, but the Azir in game 2 was miserable from him. He's had a couple of these games over the course of this year where it's just not looked very good, and I'd be lying if I said this was not absolutely one of them. This was a really bad performance from Caps, and, it's not like anybody else on the team performed particularly better. I don't want to sit here and single out Caps, but he was definitely the worst player in game number 2. A lot of those Azir moments were just not good. He was falling into the LEC Azir trap that I always talk about in these videos, where he feels like he has to be the initiator, the engager with the Shreem and Shuffle, and he puts himself in a really bad position when I think a lot of these teamfights could have been easier for him if he had just stayed on the backline and auto-attacked, like the marksman that Azir can be, and so it's frustrating to see that, but also you're playing a scaling comp. Azir plus Xayah wants to play for late game, especially alongside Ornn, even alongside Poppy. You have a very straightforward front-to-back team fight here. And look at the other side. They're Taliyah Jarvan. They need to make plays in the mid game in order to be able to keep up. And you continuously were trying to take those plays, trying to take those engages. It's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how to play your draft out. It's basically the same draft that you gave yourself in game number 1 against the same draft that NRG gave themselves in game number 1 in that same vein, or at least the same kinds of power spikes. And you played it just as bad. It's frustrating to see if you're G2. Luckily, these are fixable problems. These are basically just mental issues that you need to correct. Although I will say the mechanics in this series were not good either, and that's a concern, but you have to imagine that something was just off about G2 today, because this was not the G2 that we've seen really at any point throughout the tournament. They got slaughtered by Gen.G, yes, but Gen.G's a really good team, and you're just kind of hoping that Gen.G didn't break their mental, because that's kind of how it looked in this game. It felt like their mental was kind of broken. If G2 can get back to the form that they were at in, at the beginning of the tournament, days 1, day 2, that kind of gameplay from G2, I think they're going to be just fine. They're still a really talented team that is more than deserving of the quarterfinals, but this was a miserable performance, and this was not a quarterfinals-worthy performance, and it's not going to get easier from here. Every single team that you have the opportunity to face in the next stage is a quarterfinals-worthy team, and so You got to get your shit together quickly, but congratulations to NRG. NA's in the quarterfinals. I certainly did not expect that at this tournament. They were one of the least likely options for me to pick in the quarterfinals, but for NRG to make it there and for them to do it with such a dramatic victory over G2, was their schedule really easy? Yeah, kinda. Like, their 3 wins were against Team Liquid, Mad Lions, and G2. They didn't play a single Eastern team, or at least they didn't win against a single Eastern team to qualify for the quarterfinals, but it's not like G2 is some pushover of a team. Any kind of complaints about an easy schedule, I think, could be lobbied at a couple of other teams as well. And so, you know, for NRG, they deserve to be here. They've earned it, especially after this win. And you just have to be proud of these players in this org for, you know, really putting in the time and effort to cultivate what has been a very deserving quarterfinals appearance. And then moving on to our second series of the day here, and this one's just as interesting. We're no longer in the kind of days where we get one interesting series and one kind of blowout series. Everything from this point onwards is certainly going to be intriguing, and this one is certainly no exception. This is going to be our final team out of round number 4 to qualify for the quarterfinals. The winner of this will do so, and the loser will have to move on to that 2-2 series to get another shot. And of course, the draw, as we've already talked about, is not going to be easy, basically no matter what happens. It's a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1 and the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming. Very, very fun matchup. Talked about this a lot at the end of the video yesterday about how I genuinely think this is the closest matchup that we've gotten in the Swiss stage between 2 teams at this tournament up until this point. There have been some really fun, really close series that we've gotten, especially in the best of 3s, but when I tell you that I really can't see a massive difference between these 2 teams, I really can't see a massive difference between these 2 teams. It's very difficult to end up picking a favorite or a winner in a series like this, where both of the teams, I think, have major advantages and things they're really good at. Starting, of course, with T1. They're the team that I ranked higher of these 2 in terms of my pre-tournament primer and pre-tournament power rankings. They came in at number 3. Bilibili came in at number 5 in those rankings, and so T1 gets the edge in terms of what I was expecting from them, but they haven't quite been as clinical at this tournament as maybe you would like to see. Owner, in particular, has continued his kind of lackluster play, for lack of a better term, over the course of this past year. Ever since Faker ended up kind of dropping out of the team in summer, Owner's been a bad jungler. Now, he looked a lot better against Cloud9, a team that really does struggle to be able to stop junglers from taking over the game, even though their jungler was really good in that series in Blabber, but Owner looked a lot better there. If he can keep that upward momentum going, it's going to be a lot easier for T1 to be able to win some of these games, but you know, across the board, I think you could make an argument that maybe with the exception of mid lane, that I wouldn't really take T1's lane individually, you know, one-on-one. Like, would I say that Zeus is better than Bin? Probably not. Would I say that Owner's better than June right now? Probably not. Is Guma better than Elk? Probably not. Is Keria better than On right now? Probably not. It's certainly not looking great for T1, but what they do better than a lot of other teams is play as a team and control leads better. And so if you give them these early game focused teams that can kind of take advantage of some power spikes, then they're going to be really strong at that. And I do think they are more accomplished in terms of playing out objectives and in terms of being clinical than a team like BLG on the other side, even if their talent is a little bit less. And then for BLG, the big positive for them going into this is that I think you could make a case that all 3 of your lanes, maybe with the exception of mid lane, are better than the opposition. Bin is maybe the best top laner in the world right now. I think he's clearly proven that at this tournament. Elk and On have been phenomenal. Elk in particular has really carried some games at this tournament up until this point, but you're going to have to do it against a team in T1 that is going to kind of shut down a lot of the early game aggression and momentum that you have been generating. That's something that BLG really relies a lot upon. It's something they relied a lot on in the LPL. It's why they did really well against the bad teams and started to struggle when they played the best teams in the region like JD Gaming and like LNG. When you have a good team that knows how to take away some of the advantages that BLG has been able to generate really consistently, they're not super experienced at being able to play from a negative situation, being able to play from behind. And so that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. That being said, it's a 50-50. It really genuinely is. When I said it yesterday, when I said this was the closest series to pick and that I didn't want to name a winner, I meant that because everybody out there is going to tell you that Bilibili is the better team, but I'm just not sold on that. T1 plays so well in the back half of games, and ever since Faker has re-emerged and come back into this team, their macro has been essentially excellent, and I would expect that to continue, but Bilibili is probably more talented in terms of the individual performances. Who's going to win this? I narrowly went with BLG yesterday, but like I said, I'm going to verbatim say what I said in that video yesterday, which is, if T1 wins this, I'm going to be the least surprised of any of the analysts that you probably watch. That is just the truth of the matter, but Now we get to find out how they actually end up playing out, starting, of course, with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was T1. They are gonna take game 1. The first game in this series is gonna go in their direction, and they looked awesome in this game number 1. This was exactly what we were kind of talking about in the ways that T1 needed to win the game. Very clinical, very much kind of a scaling-oriented style, giving themselves options as you head into the late game, and then just being able to outperform your opponents in Bilibili. We talked about BLG playing well at this tournament up until this point, but remember, the big kind of narrative surrounding BLG, at least coming from me going into this tournament, was that they really hadn't performed all that well in their recent games to close out the LPL. This team really wasn't looking good when they lost to LNG in the semifinals and got blasted by Gen.G in winners finals, and a lot of these players didn't look good at the Asian games either, and so the form was certainly a question mark for Bilibili, and that was not the question mark for T1. And a lot of the negatives that we saw from BLG at the end of the year very much re-emerged in a series like this, which goes to beg the question, is Bilibili going to be able to survive against really good teams? I think that really is going to be kind of the thing on everyone's mind, but let's talk about T1 and let's talk about draft. First and foremost, I actually really like Bilibili's draft. I see a lot of people really criticizing some of the picks that they ended up going for. I do agree that the draft itself wasn't exactly expertly maneuvered, but what they ended up with was a really good situation. In my opinion, I think R5 Nidalee actually complements what they want to do relatively well, which is win early. You're looking at a bunch of lanes that are just really strong. T1 ends up counterpicking themselves in the mid lane with Azir into Orianna. A super Orianna-favored matchup, in my opinion. Probably Ori's best matchup in the current meta. Don't really know why teams keep doing this to themselves, but it is what it is. I think you can really take advantage of that mid lane early on, and obviously Nidalee Renekton is strong. Even with Gnar on the top side, Renekton should still have pressure early. Kai'Sa does a really good job being able to establish tempo early, even against Senna, although Senna is, really strong at being able to shut it down and just not really doing anything. But if you want to get out on the move and take these skirmishes in the mid game, that's very possible for Bilibili in this draft. I think there are a lot of positives to take away for Bilibili, and you're not going to see that a lot. A lot of people are going to talk about how Nidalee is just super weak right now and about, how little proactivity they have. I don't necessarily agree with that in this draft. I think you have a lot of ways to be able to control the game early. You just weren't able to do it. T1 ends up outplaying you. T1 has a lot of scaling. Like I talked about, if you hit the late game teamfight stage of this, while BLG has options, obviously Ori plus Kai'Sa is always going to be very difficult to deal with. You also have a lot of nothings. You have Renekton plus Nidalee, which is going to be difficult to kind of justify because you're going into this really hard teamfight comp of Azir, Senna, Jarvan, Gnar, like this front to back that I think is very difficult to end up dealing with, and so you don't want this game to go long. And, fortunately for BLG, it didn't, but they lost early, which is a disaster for this team comp. Player of the game was actually kind of difficult for me. There were two really good options on the side of T1. I'm going to give it to Keria on the Tahm Kench. I felt like the TK was actually super valuable this game, and Keria plays him super aggro, super aggressive. He's constantly looking to be in your face. He's constantly looking to try and deal damage or to really just poke the beast, if you will, for what he wants to do. And you don't see a lot of TKs playing this aggro, even in the early game. We talked about how there's a real opportunity for Rel to get out on the move and affect especially this mid lane and really make this like an early game advantage for Bilibili. Not if the TK is going to play this aggro and this in your face. It really kind of forces the Rel to stay in lane and protect the Kai'Sa because there's really not a lot Kai'Sa can do onto the Tahm Kench, especially in the 2v1, and so we're seeing the benefits of Senna TK coming back into the meta here. This is one of the stronger bot lane picks in the game right now, and it does seem that teams are finally adapting to that. The other player that I think you could definitely consider is Zeus on the top side on this Gnar. Very impressive performance going into what I consider to be the best top laner in the world in Bin. I know I'm a little bit lower on Renekton, but this is still a good Renekton matchup, and Zeus just outplayed him basically at every single opportunity. This was an awesome game from him. He's been really good as of late. He was their best player in playoffs. That's almost undisputable in my eyes. Faker was really good for a lot of their games, but Zeus was the one that was kind of carrying a lot of games for them in the LCK playoffs, and his form has translated to Worlds. A lot of the question marks about whether or not he's going to be able to live up to some of these bigger moments, I think are very much being answered at the current moment. It's been a really good run from Zeus, but him and Keria I think were the standouts. Everybody else did play well. Like Faker had good moments on the Azir. Guma was really influential on the Senna, especially in trying to, set up moments for the Gnar or for the Tahm Kench to be able to start taking over, and then obviously Owner was good as well, but I think mostly it was the draft that T1 really kind of had an idea of what they wanted to do and they executed on it. Getting a lead early on this was basically game over. And then for Bilibili, losing the early game was basically game over for them. You lose the scaling matchup here and you have basically 3 winning lanes, or what I would imagine would be 3 early winning lanes as long as you don't screw it up. Unfortunately, they did kind of screw it up. Dud of the game is going to go to June. This Nidalee pick did not work out. I know it's kind of the signature pick for June. We talk about it a lot in the LPL. He's one of the best Nidalee players in the world, but this is not a champion that I think really has this high power scaling right now. That being said, I think she can affect the map. She still is Nidalee. She's still going to do really well if you're able to get her going early, and she does a really good job of making sure that your scaling laners that do have advantages, things like the Orianna, actually have opportunities to be able to play a little bit aggro in the early game and try to take some of these more 1v1 or 1v2 or 2v2 trades where I think you do genuinely win a lot of them. The problem was that June just got outplayed this game, not only by Owner, but by all of the laners, whether it was him trying to get onto Zeus on the Gnar and Zeus just saying, no thanks, I'm good, I'm fine, or Senatom Kench basically shutting down everything that Nidalee wants to do in the early game. June's just in a position where he really can't play in the same way that maybe he would want to. Now, that's not to say the rest of the team didn't underperform. Yagao was not particularly good in a very good matchup, in my opinion. Bin really underperformed. Easily Bin's worst game of the tournament. He's kind of dominated up until this point, and he's really, made me look good for calling him the best top laner in the world going into this, but Zeus just outplayed him in this game. There really is no other way to say it. Bin was just not what you needed him to be, and, Elk tried. Elk did some damage on Kai'Sa, but really, Elk was also not in great positions this game. He wasn't pushing the team forward. He wasn't playing aggressive enough to try and take advantage of some of the mistakes that T1 was making. It just wasn't a very good game from Bilibili. I want to put this more on T1 playing well, specifically Keria and Zeus, but it is worth noting that, BLG has had a style that they've wanted to play all year long, and that style is very much exploitable by teams that are able to get early pressure or to negate early pressure against them, and we continuously have seen that. T1 taking an early advantage in this series isn't entirely shocking or surprising. It's just something to keep an eye on. So it's just game number 1, but BLG does have to bounce back here in game 2, or else it's going to be a very quick, clean sweep coming in from T1. Are they going to be able to get that done, or is Bilibili going to be able to even it up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to clean sweep this series, and I told you, man, T1 is not the kind of team that you can take lightly. They're going to stumble, they are going to lose their balance, but they are never going to fall. This is a team that I trusted a lot going into this tournament, and they have done nothing but reciprocate that trust to put it back out into the ether, and they looked awesome in this series. It feels like they've gotten better as this tournament has gone along, which is super important. Obviously, the loss to Gen.G isn't ideal, but it's Gen.G. They beat everybody. That's kind of just been the way that things have gone as of late. But them coming out and so decisively being able to beat Bilibili, who a lot of people rank very highly, I'm lower on them, and even I rank them pretty freaking high, is super impressive. It shows a very good understanding of how to play out a lot of the drafts that are currently very popular in the meta, and that's crazy important. I think they did a really good job of prioritizing things in draft, understanding the ways that they can change up the meta to kind of favor themselves, and even take some underutilized picks and use them at a high level, some things that might be a little bit more comfort-oriented than meta in the first place. For Bilibili, obviously, this isn't the end of your tournament life, but again, like we talked about for G2, you didn't want to lose this one. You're going to have a tough series in the next round, basically no matter what, and it's do or die now. We will get to that in a second, but let's go ahead and talk about the draft first and foremost. Again, I kind of like this draft for Bilibili. I certainly don't think it's awful. T1 does kind of put themselves in a weird position again by R1ing Orianna, and I get it. Ori Jarvan is a really strong duo combo for the Wombo in the late game. There is always going to be that part of you that's just like, screw it, it doesn't really matter the kind of matchup that we get into it, because we're going to get to the late game, and if we get to the late game, this is going to work, and I agree with that. If it gets to the late game, it is going to work, but Ori is very counterable in lane, and Bilibili clearly watches my videos. They know what I've been pushing, and that's the Syndra. I think Syndra's a really good pick into Ori, and quite frankly, we saw that this game. Yagao was really good, and we'll talk about that in a second, but this is a really bad matchup for Ori. Now, Faker did the right thing and just said, screw it. Clearly, I'm not going to be able to survive if I don't build Crown and try to be super tanky, and I'm just going to AFK mid lane and just move around the map instead, and that's a good idea. It's what you should do in this game. theoretically, Bilibili would have better answers to it. They didn't, but, you know, draft-wise, I don't think that's a very good idea. And then you have Jinx as your AD carry. I'm kind of low on Jinx. I think she's kind of a worse version of a lot of the other AD carries that we've kind of talked about, Aphelios and Sivir, and, you know, similar picks in the meta right now. Aphelios in particular, I think is just kind of a better version of Jinx, but if you want to go for her, sure, you can get a lot of resets and you can start to scale the game. She's still strong. She's just not as strong or consistent, in my opinion. And they go back to the Tahm Kench. Now, this can be good, this can be bad, but R5 Tahm actually really worked out for this team. Clearly, Keria has been practicing it. Keria is not the kind of player that is just going to play engagers. He's one of the few supports in the world right now that is very willing to move off of kind of the standard Alistar, Nautilus, Rakan style of engaged support that everybody just seems to play on loop, on repeat. And to play things like Tahm Kench. He played a lot of Lulu, basically exclusively Lulu, in the LCK playoffs, and that really worked for this team. Renata was a big pick for them in the earlier days. Like, he's going to be going for these kind of different picks, and quite frankly, they're really strong and they're really working right now. It's a shocker to me, and I've been complaining about it all year, that teams are so set in their ways because supports find it so boring to play non-engaged supports, but look what happens when you can play something a little bit different. It does work at an incredibly high level, so good stuff from T1, but not the best draft in the world, and Bilibili has options. Like I said, I like the Syndra. Outside of that, you get B1 Xayah, which is always going to be a plus in my book, because there's basically no easy answer to B1 Xayah, if we're being entirely honest. And then, you know, Bin on Jax gives you some flexibility. People really highly prioritize the Alistar, but, you know, I think you have more good picks on the side of Bilibili, in my opinion, for what this draft goes on. But again, very similar to game number 1, T1 is just better. They just outplayed Bilibili, even if Bilibili did have options, and so you got to give them a lot of credit for that. Player of the game was a tough one, man. There are a lot of great performances in this game. I'm going to give it to Owner in the jungle. What a reemergence for him. If he can hang on to this form where he's just everywhere on the map and just actively making plays, genuinely blowing up all of BLG's plans. Like, that's the Owner that we remember from 2022. That's the Owner we remember from 2023 spring when we were talking about him as one of the best junglers in the world. He feels like he's back, and that is major for this team. I've been talking about it, but Owner is literally the difference maker between this team being a quarterfinals out and being a team that can win worlds. Like, it really is that much of a difference in terms of what version of Owner ends up showing up. And it does feel like he's getting back into form, which has to be super exciting for T1 fans. You have to hope that he's going to be able to continue it, but this was a great step in the right direction. The rest of this team played well. Gumayusi went 11-0-3. He dominated a lot of these team fights. He could very well get player of the game because he was the one that was facilitated for in this game, the one capitalizing on a lot of the setup plays, but I wanted to give credit to Owner because he deserves it, man. The Jarvan was awesome. I think you could realistically give this to Faker on the Orianna as well. Really smart to build Crown this game. I know a lot of people hate non-damage mid laner builds, but I'm super for it. I've always been pro Crown. I've always been pro Everfrost. Like, I think these items are way more valuable than people give them credit for, and in this game, we definitely saw why. This was the tankiest Orianna I've ever seen in my entire life. She was unkillable. I mean, Faker was genuinely unkillable. Front line in a lot of these team fights, right next to Gragas, right next to TK, it was the Orianna, and it was a problem. They had no real way of dealing with it on the side of Bilibili, so really good stuff coming in from those three players in particular. Owner really dominating a lot of the engages in the setup. Gumayusi kind of capitalizing on those engages and setup with a lot of damage. And Faker just being a nuisance to the enemy team. Keria was still really good. Tahm Kench continuing to prove value. And Zeus was left on an island the entirety of this game. He was basically asked to 1v2. And he survived. He did a really good job. This team is clicking right now. T1 just looks good basically in every facet, in every avenue of the game. And that's a scary proposition. 2-0ing BLG is not easy. And T1 made it look like it was. And then for Bilibili on the other side, some good performances. Again, Bin got a lot of resources this game and looked okay with them. You would have liked to potentially see him carry some of the mid to late game fights a little bit harder on the Jax, if only because it's Bin. It's not like it's just some top laner who got resources. You want to see Bin be able to take over some of these games, but credit to Zeus for not really allowing that to happen, specifically in the mid game. And then I think Yagao did play really well. He wasn't really given any resources from his team, but for the most part, he was the one dealing damage and keeping these fights even remotely close. He just wasn't going to be able to do it 1v9, which is okay. Syndra's a really strong champion, and clearly she does well into Ori and has prio, but it's just, it was too much. There was too much else going on the map. Bot lane got absolutely destroyed. On was miserable this game. Mad Cow Disease has become genuinely real. Really good supports picking up Alistar and completely running it down. Whether it's Kellen, whether it's Hillisang, whether it's Lahens yesterday, like, there is something going on with Alistair that I would just recommend teams stay away from him at this point. Clearly, it's just not working out. I like Alistair, and I think he's really strong in the current meta, but it makes support players completely turn their brain off, and I'm not sure why. It happened again with On. In today's games, Elk was a lot worse. His positioning was poor. He was way too aggressive. This can be the problem with Elk sometimes, is that he is a very aggressive ADC. He is going to step up in your face and try to make those plays, and, you know, if you're losing, that can really be exploited. Even on a champion like Xayah that has so much self-peel, you can definitely put yourself in bad positions, and he just really was inconsequential to this game. Jun was out jungled. There just wasn't a lot of good to talk about from Bilibili, and that is definitely at the minor, level, a concern, right? They did lose to T1, who is looking really good, and at their best, T1 is one of the more unstoppable teams in the entire world, as I was saying, going into this tournament, but BLG needs to get that form back. This looked a lot closer to playoffs BLG than it did to, regular season or even MSI BLG, which is concerning because that version definitely has their question marks. I think the blueprint has been established for how to beat them in terms of beating them early. If you can beat them early, they don't have a ton of ways to be able to get themselves back into games. They're not very good at playing from behind, and I think we see that again here. That was our scouting report on them going into the tournament, and nothing has changed about that. They have one more series to potentially get themselves into the quarterfinals, but it's not going to be an easy draw, and there's a real chance BLG could be on the outside looking in. And then for T1 on the other side, congratulations on making the quarterfinals at home in Korea. I'm not surprised by this. I know a lot of people are going to see this as potentially an upset, but it really isn't in my mind. This was clearly, a very good team going into this tournament, and I think I'm just really excited to see T1 live up to their potential that I think we all kind of saw in them throughout the year. Alright, but that is going to do it for day number 8, my overview and analysis, and we are finally on to the win or go home final day of the Swiss stage. 3 more series remain, the longest day of Swiss potentially in terms of games. If everything goes to 3, it'll be about 9, and so certainly a fun one and only good matchups from this point onwards. We know at least, 5 of the teams that have qualified for the main stage, for the quarterfinals, I should say, here at Worlds, that being Gen.G and JD Gaming, of course, going undefeated, and then LNG, T1, and NRG from the 2-1 stage, but we're going to know our final 3 by the end of tomorrow. Let's go ahead and go over my predictions and my previews for the series, starting with D plus Kia taking on KT Rolster. This is a rematch from the 0-1 section, and obviously these teams have played a ton over the course of the LCK split. I think this is a fun matchup, but I think it's really bad for DK. I think we saw what happened when they went up against KT Rolster last time, and KT was able to get the job done. People have been underestimating this team all year long. Now, that being said, LNG did expose some of their flaws a little bit. I do think they're more talented than DK, but there is an avenue where Showmaker and Canyon just go absolutely nuts, where Deft finally clicks into place, where Kellen gets off the Alistair and starts playing a little bit better, and all of a sudden DK wins that series. Kana has honestly been a better top laner than Keen at this tournament, and that was a big positive for KT in terms of their expected outcome, but if I had to predict what was going to happen, Aiming and Lehens have simply just been too good at this tournament for me not to expect them to continue to be a positive. DK has struggled when their bot lane has not worked, and I think there's a real shot that the KT bot lane just kind of wins early on in this series, and so I'm going to go for KT, although I think this will be closer than the 0-1 series was earlier on in this tournament. And then you've got G2 taking on Bilibili Gaming. Crazy that one of these teams will not make the quarterfinals at Worlds. It's a pretty disastrous draw for both of these teams, if I'm being honest, and I know that I've kind of gotten a bad rap of being a G2 hater over the course of this tournament, but I'm going to have to continue being a G2 hater. That loss to NRG might be consequential because I think Bilibili takes this series. I think they're more talented, although, like we talked about, I think their flaws have kind of been exposed. I just think matchup-wise, G2 doesn't match up particularly well into BLG. A lot of the advantages that G2 is able to generate are through positions that BLG generally controls in most of their series, and I think this is going to be a rough situation. I think there's a real shot that NRG is the only Western team to qualify in the quarterfinals because of this draw. There were multiple teams that I think G2 could have beaten in this win or go home, and I'm really not sure BLG is one of them. I'm going to predict BLG to win this, but again, if G2 wins this, these are both, borderline A-tier teams at this tournament. I just think it's unfortunate that they're going up against each other. I think you can make an argument that they are the 2 best teams in the win or go home section, and one of them will be going home. And then for Weibo versus Fnatic, this one's a little bit easier to predict. Weibo should be able to win this series. This is a nice draw for Fnatic, though, because as I say in all of the Weibo series, it's more up to which version of Weibo ends up showing up. We've seen the good version of some of their players at this tournament so far. The Shy has been playing really well. Light seems to have gotten back on track, back on page. Crisp is in a similar boat, but we've seen some cracks in Xiaohu and in Weiwei in the recent series. That could be exploited by Fnatic, especially because Humanoid has been playing in Worlds form. He always steps it up when he gets here to international tournaments, and he's been really good. Humanoid versus Xiaohu could be a turning point for Fnatic to potentially take some advantages. In this series, it's just really hard for me to predict that Weibo doesn't have a major talent advantage between these two teams, and so I'm going to predict Weibo. That means my 3 predictions for the final 3 teams are KT Rolster, Bilibili Gaming, and Weibo Gaming. But I would love to know what you guys' thoughts are down in the comment section below. Do you agree in the 3 that I'm selecting, or do you think G2 or Damwon, or I'm sorry, D+ or Fnatic could end up making their way into the quarterfinals? Would love to hear your thoughts down below. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. Really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you are new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about Worlds every single day, and we're getting so close to the bracket stage, to the best of 5 stage, and I'm incredibly excited for that. If you are as well, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when the quarterfinals go live, when the semifinals go live, when the finals go live, and then, of course, after that, all of the off-season coverage that you could possibly want, all on this channel. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.